we've got our moderator for our next panel, Andy Parker here. So, and I also believe we have our presenter. So Andy, if you want to take it from here and introduce your panel on employment research using probability panel surveys.
Great, thank you, Tara. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Andy Parker. I'm a behavioral scientist at the RAND Corporation, and session 7 is on employment research using probability panel surveys. We have a fascinating group of 4 talks that are quite interrelated with each other and have both in terms of co-authorships and in terms of topic. The first talk is by Kathleen Mullen, who's a senior economist within USC's Center for Economic and Social Research. Her research addresses intersections between health and work, and her talk is on the value of working conditions in the US. Kathleen?
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me to this really interesting conference. I'm going to be presenting some joint work with co-authors from Harvard, UCLA, and RAND, where I formerly was employed. I'm now at USC. And now I can't go to the next slide. This is the worst presentation ever.
Just click on the slide.
Right, I did it. Okay. Okay. So it's well known that wage differentials across different demographic groups are large and persistent and only partly explained by differences in observable characteristics, like those demographics or, you know, like the occupation, for example. But it's also well known, I think, that not everything is reflected in your paycheck. So, you know, wages aren't everything, whether, you know, your job has paid time off or allows you to, you know, have some autonomy in your work or is meaningful in terms of your work. These things can, they give you value and could potentially, you know, affect the types of jobs that you choose. So the question that we're looking at in this paper is, would accounting for the value of these amenities like flexible scheduling or paid time off, would that reduce wage inequality or make it worse? And this is an empirical question. It could go either way. If workers essentially purchase amenities by accepting jobs with lower wages and desired characteristics over higher wages and undesired characteristics, then accounting for amenities would reduce observed wage differentials. But on the other hand, if highly compensated workers tend to split their compensation between wages and non-monetary job characteristics, then accounting for amenities would increase wage differentials. So it's not clear, you know, how this would, you know, kind of come out in the end. So in our paper, we use a stated preference experimental design to estimate willingness to pay for job amenities. We fielded a survey in the RAND American Life panel in December of 2015 and selected on the working population, ages 25 to 71. In the end, we end up with about 1,800 respondents. So what we do in this paper is we estimate the value of the working conditions, and then we adjust the wage structure by adding on the value of working conditions for those who have those working conditions, and then reassess the wage gaps to see how this affects observed wage differentials. So first we surveyed respondents about their current or most recent job characteristics. This also served to familiarize them with the job characteristics and their definitions that we varied later on in the survey. Then we showed them 2 hypothetical jobs, job A and job B, that varied in terms of 2 different job characteristics and the wage, and then we asked them which one they preferred. For 8 out of 10 choice pairs, we benchmarked the background characteristics to the respondent's current or most recent job. And then for 2 choice pairs, we had a common baseline job in the background. So, you know, we show all of the different working conditions that we vary, but only vary kind of 2 at a time randomly. So we offered the wage randomly varied around their current and most recent wage, estimated a logit model to obtain willingness to pay for 9 core non-wage job characteristics. And our preference estimates are scaled by the coefficient on the log wage, which means that everything that I'm going to show you is in terms of percent wage trade-offs. So this is a screenshot just to show you what the research design looked at. So we asked respondents to choose between job A or job B. Sorry, there was some weird background noise there. We asked them to assume that the jobs were the same in all other ways, including on characteristics not listed on the table. So this was trying to head off, whether or not it looked like, job A seems like it's kind of a better job. Maybe it's also better on something that's kind of not observed, in the background. So we asked them not to do that. And then I just added this like at the last minute because of the previous talk about attention checks. So we did add these 2 attention checks randomly at 2 places in the sort of first and second thirds of the survey to see what was going on. About half of people responded to both of the attention checks correctly, and 2/3 it got at least one of them right. And it didn't seem to affect the actual, estimates, but it seems like it seemed worth talking about. So so one thing that so I mentioned that we estimate the evaluations for different characteristics. I don't have a lot of time to go into detail on this with the short presentation, but here I'm just going to highlight a couple of things. So here's estimated valuations for the different amenities for men in blue and women in red, and you can see that for certain wage characteristics, there are big differences. So for example, the average woman, female worker needs a 19% wage increase to go from a moderately to a heavily physical job, and 15% to go from a moderately physical to a job to a mostly sitting job. So the preferred job here is one with moderate physical activity. Oh, shoot. Yes, sorry. The preferred job is one with moderate physical activity. Heavy physical activity is the worst. But for men, it's about half that. So women really care a lot more than men in our sample about avoiding physical activity. Similarly, 10 days of paid time off were equivalent to an 18% wage increase for women, 15% for men. Sorry, there's a typo here. Even though this is only a 4% reduction in labor supply, if you take, the 10 days out of 250 over the course of the year. So, big differences here as well. And there's probably some sort of background characteristic like job security that's going in, here. So altogether, women, if you add up all the amenity values on the right graph here, women value this set of wage characteristics at higher rates than men. And you can see they're pretty big differences. So on average, people value this set of working conditions at about 56% of their current wage. So finally, this is hilarious. It's like obscured on my screen, but it's well known that women make about 79 cents on the dollar, for every dollar of paid work that men make. But at the same time, women have jobs with less physical work and more paid time off, and they value those jobs more than men. So once we account for the value of working conditions and incidence of working conditions for women and men, we actually find that this narrows the wage gap, for the gender wage gap, to 83 cents. So, this is something I think we do need to be a little bit careful about. Like, preferences aren't, biological. They're driven by, many factors. So if your, kid's daycare always calls the woman in the relationship and not the man, then this could, basically sort of have this effect that culturally women care a lot more about, paid time off or flexible work schedules. And so that could be, what's contributing to the preferences. So I think some future work that looks at differences the underlying kind of production function for preferences, could be a value here. And then the paper has a lot more, in terms of it shows by age, race, education, just wage inequality more generally. But, in the interest of time, I'm going to focus just on our estimates by education, in addition to gender. And so, here you can see that people with higher education tend to value these non-wage amenities more than people, with lower education. So you can see, for example, big differences in valuing telecommuting or the option to telecommute And again, physical activity is something that, varies quite a bit. And even though there's not a lot of power to kind of differentiate the overall, estimates of the total bundle of non-wage amenities, on average, people with college degrees, or as education gets, larger, you see bigger differences in how people value wage amenities. So how does this affect the sort of returns to schooling? So if you don't account for any differences in working conditions and just look at wages, college graduates earn about 55% more than non-college graduates. But again, they tend to have better working conditions, and we've just seen they value those working conditions more. So now it turns out that accounting for the value of amenities and differences in working conditions actually increases the returns to schooling or the wage gap, in education. So it goes the opposite direction. So finally, in this paper, we see significant differences in preferences for amenities across different demographic groups. Workers care about these amenities quite a lot. Switching from the worst to the best job is worth 56% wage increase. And we see substantial changes in wage distributions once we adjust for the value of amenities. I showed you an example, the gender gap that got narrower, but in most cases, we find that wage inequality is actually wider when accounting for the incidence and value of amenities. So with that, I will thank you very much.
Thanks, Kathleen. That was great. I failed to mention at the beginning of the session, but the speakers here opted to take questions in between the talks, unlike the prior session. So does anybody have any questions for Kathleen? Well, I'll cede the discussion. Kathleen, a couple of things. One, you mentioned in your final slide the people's differential preferences for different amenities. There's a fairly well-known finding in behavioral economics of an endowment effect, that people tend to differentially value things that they have. I wonder if, I recognize this goes beyond your data, if you could speculate on whether or not that might have an effect here.
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and it doesn't go beyond our data at all. We have actually a couple of different things that we do to try to tease out endowment effects versus, what you would see if people who, presumably, right, stated preferences should tell you something about revealed preferences, and so you should see evidence of people sorting into jobs that they value. So, which is a little bit hard to differentiate from an endowment effect. So we do find evidence that people who have, certain working conditions value them more than people who don't have them. That's consistent with both stories. We also find evidence that people who value certain working conditions are more likely to transition to jobs in a 3-year follow-up period with those working conditions, conditional on what they've already had. There is some asymmetry in transitioning, to a job with a working condition you value versus away from a job with a working condition that you value, that I think may point towards some evidence of an endowment effect, in there already as well. But yeah, I think that's definitely something that's probably going on here. And then you kind of wonder, right, in the post-pandemic era, now that all these people have had the ability to telecommute that they didn't have before, if we did this survey now, would we see a lot of people with even higher preferences for things like telecommuting? That would also be consistent, I think, with an endowment effect.
Fantastic. We have a question in the chat from John Lee. With the large shift in work availability and worker preferences since the pandemic, can you give us how the relative value of different conditions has shifted?
Yeah, so this is pre-pandemic data, and we haven't repeated the survey in the post-pandemic world, but I do have a project that's funded by the National Science Foundation, where we are thinking about redoing some aspects of this survey, in the post-pandemic world. Right now, what we're doing is we're collecting sort of some preliminary data to just get people, instead of to do the full stated choice experiment, to just sort of tell us what are things that they value now that we can compare, to the past. We added some things too. that we didn't have in the past. So one thing that seems to emerge, have emerged recently is a preference, not just for, working all the time offsite or all the time on site, but this partial sort of, part of the time, in both places. And so we added something about that. And then we also added stuff about, dealing with like unruly customers, which has emerged as a narrative as well. So, so stay tuned. I think we'll have some interesting findings.
Wonderful. And that also ties into Marco's talk later about working from home. So I think, like I said, there's some nice connections between these talks.